Karen said it was a tragic accident. But her hands, gripping my son's shoulders just a moment before, told a different story. And the camera I found, it captured the truth of his final breath. The scream tore through him first, a sound so raw and primitive it felt like a physical tearing of his very being. Mark didn't even register who was screaming. All he saw was the flash of a small, bright red swim trunk, the sudden disappearance beneath the mirrored surface of the HOA pool. The world went silent for a single horrifying second before the chaos erupted. He was already running, his lungs burning, his mind a hollow chamber echoing a single frantic prayer. No, 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 no. The lifeguard, a teenage girl with wide, panicked eyes, was already in the water. Mark didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He hit the water in a desperate, clumsy dive, his body a heavy, uncoordinated mass. He fumbled, searching for the bright red, for the small, precious limbs. It was the lifeguard who found him, bringing Leo's limp body to the surface. Mark's hands were there in an instant, cradling his son, his mind screaming at the boy to breathe, to just breathe. The world returned in a dizzying, sickening rush of color and sound. The shrill of sirens, the frantic, useless compressions of the EMTs, the high-pitched sobs of his wife Sarah, who had collapsed on the concrete edge. And then there was Karen. Karen, the HOA president, stood a few feet away, her posture a masterpiece of performative distress. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair was untouched by the humid summer air, and her blue linen dress was still immaculate. She wasn't just observing. She was curating the scene. She was already speaking to a responding officer, her voice a low, modulated drone. "A terrible, terrible accident," she was saying, wringing her hands with a theatrical flourish. "He just slipped. One moment he was on the diving board, the next, he was gone. I tried to shout, but it all happened so fast." Mark didn't hear the rest. He was staring at her hands. The same hands she was now wringing together were the same hands he had seen just moments before on his son's shoulders. He'd only caught a glimpse, a flash in the periphery of his vision as he was fetching a towel for Leo. He'd seen Karen standing near the diving board, talking to his son, her expression unreadable from a distance. Then he'd heard Leo's joyous yell as he prepared to jump, followed by the sickening splash and the silence. It was the last memory he had of his son alive, a fleeting moment of joy stolen by an unthinkable tragedy. He felt the officer's hand on his shoulder, his words a distant rumble. "Sir, we need you to step back." Mark shook the hand off. "Karen," he rasped, his voice a broken thing. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "What were you saying to him? What were you doing?" Karen's theatrical composure cracked for a split second, a flicker of something cold and sharp in her eyes before it was replaced by a look of sorrowful pity. "Mark, please," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "I was just telling him what a good swimmer he was. I was encouraging him. This is not the time for accusations." Her husband, David, a man built like a brick wall and with a permanent scowl, stepped forward. "My wife is right, Mark. She just saw your boy slip. A tragic accident, that's all." He laid a firm hand on Karen's arm, as if to protect her, to shield her from a truth Mark felt in his bones. But Mark knew his son. He knew Leo was a fish, a small, fearless water demon who'd been swimming since he was 3. He wasn't prone to slipping, not on dry pavement, and certainly not on a diving board he had leapt from 100 times before. The HOA pool was his sanctuary, his final, fleeting sanctuary. The following days were a blur of unimaginable pain. The house, once filled with the joyous echoes of Leo's laughter, was a tomb. Sarah moved through it like a ghost, her silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. The funeral was a sea of black suits and empty platitudes. Neighbors offered condolences, their eyes filled with genuine grief, but Mark couldn't connect with them. All he could see were Karen and David, standing together at the graveside, their faces somber but their eyes, when they thought no one was looking, holding a calculating emptiness. A week later, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. Mark opened it with trembling hands, a new wave of nausea hitting him. He expected a bill for the ambulance, or maybe a notice about the pool closure. Instead, it was a terse, impersonal memo about an incident report and a reminder of the liability waivers all residents signed. It mentioned that a review of the pool's security system was being conducted, but that due to ongoing maintenance issues, footage from the time of the incident was corrupted. Mark crumpled the letter in his fist, his suspicion solidifying into a cold, hard certainty. He wasn't a detective, but he knew a cover-up when he saw one. The very idea of the video being corrupted felt like a slap in the face. Karen had control of the HOA, which meant she had control of everything. The security cameras, the incident reports, the narrative. She had crafted her story, a narrative of a tragic accident, and was using the HOA's bureaucracy to make it fact. He started his own investigation, a one-man crusade born of grief and a burning need for the truth. He went to the HOA office and asked to see the security logs. The assistant, a nervous woman named Brenda, looked at him with an expression of deep pity. She said Karen had already handled it, and the files were gone. Mark went to the pool. He paced the perimeter, his eyes scanning the chain-link fence, the entrance, and the walls. The cameras were mounted high, a pair of them, one pointed at the gate and the other at the pool deck. They were standard issue, nothing fancy. He knew a bit about cameras from his old job in IT. Even if the live feed was corrupted, there was almost always a local backup, a hard drive storing the data for a few weeks before it was overwritten. He couldn't shake the feeling that a local, off-site backup existed. It was standard practice for any serious security system. His search led him to the HOA's former security consultant, a retired man named Gus. Mark found him through an old invoice he pulled from a box of HOA meeting minutes. Gus lived in a small, tidy bungalow at the edge of the development. The man was initially cautious, unwilling to get involved. But Mark didn't leave. He told him about his son, about Karen's flimsy alibi, about the missing footage. He spoke about the hole in his life, the silence that had replaced a child's laughter. Finally, Gus's resolve cracked. "Karen's a piece of work," he grumbled, shaking his head. "Always trying to cut corners." She wanted to save a buck, so she went with a cheap system. No cloud backup. Everything went to a hard drive in a utility closet by the tennis courts. She told me she was going to get a better system, but she never did. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. "Is it still there?" "The hard drive?" Gus gave him a knowing look. "I don't know. I retired a few months ago, but I still have a key to that closet. Got a spare copy before I left, just in case they ever needed me for an emergency. And she never asked for it back." He gestured for Mark to follow him. The utility closet was a small, stuffy room filled with dusty pool chemicals and cleaning supplies. Tucked behind a shelf of chlorine buckets, Mark found it. A small black box, the DVR unit. The power cord was unplugged. Gus had been right. It was a cheap unit, but the hard drive inside was intact. The flashing green light on the unit was a beacon of hope in the darkness. Gus handed him the unit. "Don't tell her you got this from me," he warned. "Karen's a vindictive woman. She'll make my life a living hell." Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He drove home, the DVR unit clutched in his hands like a holy artifact. He bypassed Sarah, who was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at a muted television screen. He went to his study, a room he had once used for work, now just a mausoleum of memories. He connected the DVR to his computer, his fingers trembling as he navigated the ancient user interface. It took him an hour, but he found the raw video files. He selected the date and time of the incident, his breath catching in his throat. The video loaded, grainy and washed out by the midday sun. He watched as his son, a tiny figure in a red swim trunk, bounced on the edge of the diving board. He saw Karen walking over, her hands tucked into her pockets, her expression a blank mask. He saw her say something to Leo, something Mark couldn't make out on the silent video, and then he saw it. Leo turned to jump, his back to the camera, a final unbridled moment of childish joy. And in that split second, Karen's hands came out of her pockets. Not to grab him, not to save him. Her right hand shot out, not in a frantic motion, but a controlled, deliberate push. It was a slight movement, a half-inch shift, but it was enough. Enough to knock Leo off balance. Enough to send him twisting in the air, a small red blur of a body, his legs failing to find the water. Enough to ensure he would not make a clean entry. enough to send him plummeting into the water, a silent, drowning twist. Mark's grief, so heavy and vast for so long, vanished. It was replaced by a fire, a cold, clean-burning rage that consumed every part of him. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. And he would not rest until she paid. The fire in Mark's belly was an inferno. It wasn't the searing heat of rage he'd felt before, the kind that flares and then consumes itself. This was a cold, precise burn, fueled by the grainy video on his screen. He replayed the half-second push a dozen times, 100. He zoomed in on Karen's face, a mask of practiced neutrality that broke for a fleeting instant just before her hand shot out. There was no pity there, no surprise, only a chilling, almost bored determination. It was the face of a person swatting a fly, and his son was the fly. He didn't know how long he sat there, the DVR humming quietly beside his keyboard. The silence of the house, once a suffocating reminder of his loss, now felt like a fragile, sacred vessel holding his righteous anger. He had to show Sarah. She had to see. He unplugged the DVR, clutching it to his chest like a shield, and walked out into the living room. Sarah was still there, a statue on the sofa, a blanket draped over her knees. The television still hummed, displaying a silent infomercial for kitchen gadgets. She didn't look up as he approached. Her eyes, sunken and hollow, were fixed on some distant, invisible point. "Sarah," he said, his voice a strange, low sound. He knelt in front of her, the DVR a solid weight in his hands. "I found something." She blinked slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth. "What is it, Mark? The HOA sent another letter? We can just throw it away." "No," he said, his voice raw. He placed the DVR on the coffee table between them. "It's about Leo. I was right." He saw a flicker of confusion, then a painful weariness in her eyes. "Mark, please. We can't keep doing this. We need to let him rest. I can't," he insisted, his words tumbling over each other. "Not after what I saw. I found the security video. The one they said was corrupted." He fumbled with the remote, connecting the DVR to the TV. His hands trembled as he navigated to the video file, the same one he had watched 1,000 times in the past hour. The grainy footage filled the large screen. Sarah's gaze finally fully focused. She saw the bright red swim trunks on the diving board. She saw Karen. Her brow furrowed in confusion, then in a flash of recognition. "Oh, that's Karen. What was she doing there?" "Just watch," Mark whispered. The camera, in its distant, silent, third-person perspective, showed the moment. Leo, his back to the camera, his small, excited body bouncing. Karen, a few feet away, her hands seemingly in her pockets. Then the almost imperceptible shift, the sudden movement of her hand. The subtle half-inch push, the way Leo's body twisted in the air, a small puppet with its strings suddenly cut. The sickening splash. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, a soft, pathetic sound. Her face, which had been pale and slack for a week, became a mask of horrified comprehension. Her eyes went wide, not with tears, but with a dry, searing disbelief. She looked from the screen to Mark, her face an unreadable mix of terror and denial. "No," she breathed, the single word a quiet, final judgment. That's not real. That's not what happened." "It is," Mark said, his voice breaking. "I saw it." She pushed him. "No!" Sarah shouted, a sudden, desperate flare of anger igniting in her. She sprang to her feet, knocking the DVR and the remote to the floor. "No, Mark! You don't understand! You didn't see it! It was an accident! Karen said so. She said she tried to save him." He grabbed her arms, forcing her to look at him. "She lied, Sarah. She lied. The video doesn't lie. Look at me. Look at me and tell me you didn't see what I saw." Tears finally, violently, spilled from her eyes. "I don't want to see it. I don't want to believe it. Why would she do that? Why would anyone do that? We need to let him rest, Mark. Please." She pulled away from him, her body shuddering with sobs. The denial, he realized, was a shield. The truth was too terrible, too raw for her to handle. It would mean that their son's death wasn't just a random tragedy. It was a vicious, calculated act. And that fact was more unbearable than the loss itself. He let her go. He couldn't force her to see. He had to handle this himself. The next morning, with the DVR unit wrapped in a towel and tucked into a laptop bag, Mark went to the local police station. He walked past the bored faces, the chipped paint on the walls, and the posters for missing persons, each one a fresh stab to his heart. A burly sergeant with a weary face and a name tag that read Sergeant Miller looked up from his computer. "How can I help you, sir?" Mark placed the bag on the counter. "My name is Mark Harris. My son Leo drowned in the HOA pool a week ago. The incident report said it was an accident. It wasn't." He unzipped the bag and took out the DVR. "I found the security footage. It proves it was murder." Sergeant Miller's weary face didn't change. He nodded slowly, then sighed. "All right, Mr. Harris. Look, I know you're grieving. I understand. But we had 2 officers on the scene, an EMT report, and statements from witnesses. We've already closed the case as an accidental drowning. But the evidence," Mark insisted, pushing the DVR forward. "The HOA said the video was corrupted." "It wasn't. I have it right here." Miller leaned forward, a glimmer of sympathy in his eyes. But it was a well-worn, almost practiced sympathy. "Mr. Harris, I'm not authorized to look at this. You need to file a formal complaint and bring the evidence to a detective. I can get you a form, but they're backed up. Could take weeks." "Weeks?" Mark exploded, his voice rising. "My son was murdered. Weeks is too long! Just look at the video!" Miller's face hardened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down. I'm just telling you the procedure. The HOA already submitted a report on the incident, and they have an incident file. Any new evidence has to go through the proper channels." He gestured to a small pile of forms on the counter. "Here, take these. Fill them out and drop them back off. We'll get to it when we can." Mark stared at him, the indifference in the man's eyes a worse insult than Karen's feigned sympathy. The cold, institutional apathy of the system was just as deadly as the woman who had killed his son. He snatched the forms, but he knew in his heart he wasn't going to use them. He drove home, his fury building with every stoplight. The police weren't going to help. They didn't care. They saw a grieving father, not a man with proof. He had to take a different approach. He had to make her pay, and he had to do it on his own terms. He thought about the HOA's annual summer picnic. It was scheduled for this weekend, the very place where his son had died, the place where Karen would be, in her element, the undisputed queen of the cul-de-sac. He knew he had to confront her there, in front of everyone. He wouldn't just show the video. He would expose her. He would make the whole neighborhood see what he saw. He would shatter her perfect little world. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw a black sedan parked across the street. A man was sitting in the driver's seat. A man with a permanent scowl, David, Karen's husband. Mark felt a jolt of recognition. The same man who had been a brick wall protecting her at the pool was now staking out his house. The message was clear. They knew he was looking for something. They knew he was a threat. He got out of his car and met David's stare. David didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply raised his chin in a silent, menacing challenge. A threat. Mark didn't flinch. He walked slowly, deliberately into his house. He knew then that the game was on. The forms from the police station lay forgotten on the passenger seat. He didn't need a system that couldn't see the truth. He had the truth. And he had a plan. He would confront her at the picnic, in front of the whole neighborhood, with the video that would tear her life apart. And he would see what she would do then. Would she deny it? Would she threaten him? He was about to get his answer. HOA's annual summer picnic was a fortress of normalcy, a sun-drenched facade of laughter and community that felt alien to Mark. The air, thick with the scent of grilling burgers and cut grass, hummed with the high-pitched joy of children. A live band, a local cover group, played a saccharine pop anthem on a small stage near the tennis courts. Mark walked through it all like a ghost, his laptop bag a heavy, pulsating presence against his leg. Every step he took on the manicured lawn felt like a violation of a sacred trust, a trust this neighborhood had broken in the most brutal way possible. He scanned the crowd. Children shrieked with delight as they chased each other through the sprinklers. Their parents, oblivious and smiling, socialized by the picnic tables. And there she was. Karen, the undisputed queen of this plastic kingdom, was holding court. She was dressed in a crisp white sundress, her face a picture of serene, effortless leadership. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a group of neighbors hanging on her every word. She was in her element, the sun glinting off the surface of the very pool where she had killed his son. Mark felt the cold, clean burn in his stomach intensify. He moved with a purpose that felt foreign to his exhausted body. He bypassed the food lines, ignored the greetings from people who had once been his friends, and walked directly towards aKaren. David saw him first. His scowl, once just a menacing expression, now looked like a permanent fixture. He said something to aKaren, a quiet word that made her laugh falter. Her smile became a tight, practiced line as she turned to face Mark. "Mark," she said, her voice dropping to a low, soothing tone, a sound meant to placate, not to greet. "It's good to see you. We've all been so worried about you and Sarah." Mark stopped a few feet from her, his hands gripping the straps of his laptop bag. The laughter around them seemed to shrink, the music to fade into a distant drone. A few people noticed the tension and discreetly backed away, their smiles turning to expressions of uncomfortable curiosity. "I'm sure you have, aKaren," Mark said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You were so worried, in fact, that you tried to make sure no one would ever see what you did." Her eyes, a pale blue that had once seemed friendly, now held a cold, unwavering hardness. "Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. I've only ever been a friend to you and your family. This is neither the time nor the place for this." "It's the only place," Mark shot back, his voice rising, drawing more attention. "It's where he took his last breath." "And you were there. You were there when he died." David stepped in front of her, a physical barrier. "Mark, you need to leave. You're making a scene." "A scene?" Mark's voice was now a shout, carrying over the hum of the crowd. "My son is dead. My son is dead because of her." The music stopped. The band, sensing the shift in mood, had shut down their set. A tense silence fell over the picnic. Every eye was on them. Mark didn't hesitate. He unzipped the laptop bag and pulled out the DVR, the small black box that contained his proof. He held it up for everyone to see. "They said the security footage was corrupted." "They lied! They hid this! They were covering for her!" A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and disbelief. Karen's composure finally broke. A flash of genuine panic crossed her face, a raw terror that was more revealing than any confession. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched, not to comfort him, but to grab the device. Mark sidestepped her. "You want this?" he shouted. "You want everyone to see what you did?" He took the laptop from his bag, the same laptop he had used to view the footage. His fingers, working on pure muscle memory, opened the file. The silent, grainy video began to play. The crowd pressed in, their faces a jumble of expressions. They saw the diving board. They saw a small figure in a red swim trunk. They saw aKaren, her face a blank mask. They saw the movement of her hand, the subtle half-inch push. The first sound was a collective gasp, followed by a woman's high-pitched wail. A few people pointed, their fingers trembling. Mark saw it all. The shock, the horror, the dawning realization that the woman they trusted, the HOA president who organized their potlucks, was a cold-blooded killer. aKaren, her face ashen, lunged again, this time with a primal ferocity. Mark held her off with one arm, his other hand on the laptop. "See what she's doing?" he screamed. "She's trying to destroy the evidence, just like she destroyed my son." But David, a silent, menacing presence until now, had a different plan. He didn't go for the laptop. He threw a single, powerful punch. It connected with Mark's jaw, a staggering blow that sent him reeling backwards. The laptop flew from his hands, skidding across the grass, the video still playing on its screen. Mark hit the ground hard, his head bouncing off the lawn. The air rushed out of his lungs. He was dazed, the world a spinning, blurry mess of blue sky and panicked faces. David stood over him, his scowl a look of twisted triumph. "Someone call the police," David shouted, his voice a loud, booming lie that cut through the chaos. "He just attacked us. He's crazy. He's been in a state of delusion since his son died." The crowd, which had moments ago been unified in its horror, was now a fractured, confused mess. The video still played on the screen of the abandoned laptop, but their attention had been ripped away by the violence. People screamed. Two men, neighbors who had once been friendly, grabbed Mark's arms, holding him down, and then Mark saw him. A young man, a teenager who worked for the HOA, knelt by the laptop. He had been standing near the band, a silent, awkward observer. He picked up the laptop, his eyes darting to David, then to Karen, who was now clutching her husband's arm. The teenager unplugged the DVR and, with a silent, deliberate motion, he walked away. He wasn't running, not yet. He was just moving with a speed that said he knew exactly what he was doing. Mark thrashed against the men holding him down, but it was no use. "The video!" he screamed, his voice a raw, desperate thing. "He's taking the video!" But it was too late. As a police officer, a beefy man with a no-nonsense face, arrived on the scene, Mark saw the teenager disappear behind the community center. The small black DVR unit and his laptop, the only proof of Karen's crime, gone. He was pinned to the ground, his face swollen and bleeding. The whole neighborhood now looking at him not as a victim, but as a deranged man who had just violently attacked the HOA president and her husband. His plan had backfired. His desperate grab for justice had failed, leaving him stripped of his evidence, his credibility, and his dignity. And as the police officer knelt down to handcuff him, Mark knew he had just played into their hands. The clink of the handcuffs was a final, damning punctuation mark on the public spectacle. The world, which had spun in a dizzying chaos of blue sky and shouting neighbors, now narrowed to the sterile, confined space of the police car. Mark's wrists ached, a sharp, constant pain that was almost a welcome distraction from the hollow ache in his chest. His face, still numb from the force of David's punch, throbbed with every beat of his heart. The officer who drove the car was silent, his profile impassive as he navigated the familiar streets of the neighborhood, a neighborhood that now felt like a foreign country. Mark looked at the perfectly manicured lawns, the cheerful flags on front porches, and the sun-drenched facade of the place he had called home. It was all a lie. He had spent his life living in a gilded cage with a monster at the center of it. At the station, the process was a blur of fluorescent lights and indifferent faces. He was booked, his mugshot taken. He was Mark Harris, the man who had just assaulted the HOA president. The truth he held, the cold, hard proof of his son's murder, was a secret known only to him. Sergeant Miller, the same weary-faced officer from the other day, watched the process with a detached smirk. "Told you to fill out the paperwork, didn't I, Mr. Harris?" he said, his voice a low, mocking rumble. "Maybe next time you'll listen." Mark didn't answer. He was beyond words. His entire being was a single silent scream of fury. He was locked in a small, concrete cell, the door slamming shut with the sound of a final, irrevocable defeat. He sat on the bench, his head in his hands, the rage finally giving way to a sickening wave of despair. He had done everything wrong. He had let his grief and anger dictate his actions, and in his desperation, he had not only lost his evidence, but had also handed his enemies a clear, legal victory. He had been a fool. Sarah came to see him a few hours later. He saw her through the bars, her face ashen and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't look at him like a man who had been unjustly wronged. She looked at him like a man who had lost his mind. "Mark," she whispered, her voice a thin, fragile thread. "What have you done?" "I tried to show them," he said, his voice raspy. "I showed them the video, Sarah. I had proof." She shook her head, a slow, mournful motion. "The police said you attacked Karen and David. They said you were delusional." "Please, Mark, just tell me it's not true. Just tell me you didn't do this." The denial, once a whisper, was now a shout. It was a wall between them, thick and unyielding. The truth, for her, was a burden too heavy to bear. It would mean their son's death wasn't just a random tragedy. It would mean they lived next to a killer. That they had been friends with her. The horror was too vast for her to face. "They took the video," Mark said, his voice breaking. "A kid grabbed it in the chaos. He has it." "He has the proof." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. She leaned closer to the bars. "Please, Mark, just stop." "Just come home, let it go. We can't get him back." Her words, meant to comfort, felt like a betrayal. He was fighting for their son's memory, for his justice, and she was begging him to surrender. He sat back, the distance between them feeling wider than the Atlantic Ocean. He was on his own, Meanwhile, a few miles away, a teenager named Josh sat in his bedroom, staring at the black rectangular DVR unit on his desk. He was not a hero. He was just a kid, 18 years old, working an entry-level job for the HOA to save up for a used car. He had seen the whole thing, the father's desperate plea, the silent video, Karen's lunge, and David's brutal punch. And in the ensuing chaos, he had acted on pure instinct. He had seen the laptop on the ground, its screen flashing with the damning video, and he had grabbed the DVR. He didn't know why. It just felt wrong for it to be lying there, exposed. He had seen the raw, naked terror in Karen's eyes before she regained her composure, and it had scared him more than anything he had ever witnessed. He had watched the video twice now. The first time, he was a witness. The second time, he was a believer. He saw the subtle push, the unblinking coldness in Karen's eyes. He had the proof, and it was terrifying. He paced his room, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. What was he supposed to do? Go to the police? The father had tried that, and look what happened. Go back to the HOA? No, absolutely not. He had seen David's menacing stare, the way he had moved with the chilling certainty of a man who owned the world. He was in way over his head. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit on this. A boy was dead. He thought about his little sister, the way she played in the sprinklers just a few hours ago, the innocent joy on her face. He had to do this for the man who was in jail and for the boy who would never play again. He grabbed his phone and, with trembling fingers, looked up the name of the man who had been arrested. Mark Harris. He found his house, found his wife's name. He saw their faces in the local news report on the incident. A picture of Mark looking wild and unkempt. The headline screaming about an assault at the HOA picnic. He had to get the evidence to someone who would listen. He thought about the man who had looked him in the eyes as he was taken away. Mark Harris. He had to get this to him, but how? He couldn't just walk into the police station. His mind raced. He had an idea, a risky one, but he couldn't think of another way. He would send it to Sarah, the boy's mother. She was still at the house. He would leave it on her doorstep, anonymously. He would just ring the doorbell and leave. He packed the DVR and the laptop into a backpack. He put on a hoodie, pulled the hood over his face, and crept out of his house, his heart pounding. He made it 2 blocks before he saw it. A black SUV parked on the curb, its engine idling. The same SUV he had seen at the picnic. David was in the driver's seat. He didn't seem to be watching Josh's house, but his eyes were fixed on the street, his face a grim, stony mask. It was a surveillance he hadn't expected. He was being watched. Josh turned around and ran back into his house, a panicked fear gripping him. He was trapped. They were not just watching Mark. They were watching the whole neighborhood, and they were looking for the evidence he was holding. He was no longer just a witness. He was a target. The panic was a cold, gripping hand around Josh's throat. He scrambled back into his house, his heart hammering against his ribs. He threw the backpack containing the DVR and laptop onto his bed, his mind reeling. They knew. They had to know. Why else would they be watching his street? The thought was absurd, a paranoid delusion, but he couldn't shake it. He had a brief, horrifying memory of David's cold, menacing stare at the picnic, the way his eyes had followed every move. It wasn't a coincidence. He peered out his bedroom window, his body pressed low against the sill. The black SUV was still there, a silent, predatory beast on the curb. David was a dark silhouette behind the tinted glass, a grim reaper in a luxury vehicle. Josh felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He wasn't just in over his head. He was drowning. His phone buzzed on his desk. It was his mom. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her voice cheerful, unaware. "You home? I'm coming back from the grocery store. Do you need me to grab anything for your dinner tonight?" "No, Mom," Josh said, his voice too high, too tight. "No, I'm good. Just get home safe, okay?" "Of course," she said, her tone suddenly cautious. "Everything all right?" "Yeah, fine. Just tired. I'll see you in a bit." He hung up, his hands shaking. The terror was no longer just for himself. They were watching his house. They were watching his family. He felt the weight of the DVR on his bed, the tangible proof of a lie, and the burden of it was unbearable. He had to get rid of it, but not by giving it back to them. He had to expose them. He thought about the local news station, They had a hotline for anonymous tips. He could just call them. But what if they asked for the evidence? He couldn't risk leaving it on the street. He had to find a way to get the video to someone without ever leaving his house. An idea, a desperate, reckless one, formed in his mind. He would upload the video. He would put it on the internet. Make it public. He would create a dead man's switch, a failsafe. If they came for him, the video would already be out there for the world to see. It was the only way to protect himself and to ensure the truth came out. He grabbed the laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He created an anonymous account on a video sharing site, his mind focused with a singular, desperate clarity. He titled the video simply, "The Truth About the HOA Pool Accident." He uploaded the file, the progress bar creeping along the screen. Each percentage point was a tiny victory, a tiny step closer to justice. Suddenly, a notification flashed on his screen. A pop-up from his antivirus software. Suspicious activity detected. Malicious connection blocked. Josh's blood ran cold. He looked down at the notification, then at the still-moving progress bar. The upload was still happening. But the alert, he wasn't a computer expert, but he knew what it meant. They had a backdoor. They had an IT guy, maybe a hacker, someone on their payroll. They weren't just watching his house. They were monitoring his network. They knew exactly what he was doing. They were trying to stop him. He slammed the laptop shut. He looked out the window. The black SUV was still there. He had to be faster, smarter. He had to get the evidence out of his house. The internet was a trap. He needed a different plan, one that didn't involve his network. He had to physically move the evidence. Meanwhile, in his cell, Mark stared at the concrete walls. He had to get out. He had to find that kid. He had to find Josh. He had been a fool to think he could do this on his own. He needed allies. He needed someone who wasn't afraid, but who? He thought about Sarah. He thought about her fear, her denial. He had pushed her away. He had to apologize. He had to get her on his side. He had to make her see the truth, no matter how painful. She was his only link to the outside world, to the truth. She was his lifeline. Back at home, Sarah was a mess. She had a lawyer for Mark on the phone, a gruff, expensive man David had recommended. He had said he could get the charges dropped if Mark agreed to psychiatric evaluation. He was saying something about an emotional breakdown and a momentary lapse in judgment. Sarah listened, her hand shaking. He was offering a lifeline, a way to make all of this go away. But her husband was in a jail cell. She was a woman who had lost her son, and now, it seemed, her sanity. She felt a gnawing feeling of unease. A lie. It was all a lie. The words of the lawyer, the sympathy of her neighbors, the pity in Sergeant Miller's eyes. It was all built on a lie. She looked at her phone, at the last text message Mark had sent her before the picnic. It had been a picture of Leo's red swim trunks. A simple picture, but it spoke volumes. She knew she had to go to the police station. She had to talk to her husband. She had to confront the truth, even if it shattered her world. It was her son's final wish, his last breath in a cold pool, and she was a mother who would no longer be silent. She picked up her keys, her hand no longer shaking, and back in his bedroom, Josh felt a new wave of panic. He had to get out of the house. He had to take the evidence and run. He couldn't trust his internet, and he couldn't trust his street. He had to do something drastic. He looked at the window, at the black SUV parked outside. He had to find a way to escape. He looked at the laptop and the DVR, then back at the window. He was a teenager with a secret that a killer wanted to bury. He had to get it out. He made a decision. He would find a different way. He would send the evidence, but not by road. He looked at the small, narrow alley behind his house, a dark,